My name is Arthur, and just last Sunday, in the house I built with my own two hands, my son told me my life was nothing more than a collection of meaningless stories. He said it with a smile, in front of his friends, while his own children made a joke of my deepest memories. It was the moment I realized I wasn't a father anymore. I was a burden. What would you do in my place? I need you to listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done? And please, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. It was a typical Sunday afternoon in our Dallas suburb. The air smelled of grilled burgers and freshly cut grass, the sounds of laughter echoing across the backyard I'd landscaped myself 30 years ago. My son Kevin and his wife Jessica were hosting some of their friends, people I didn't know, with expensive clothes and easy smiles. I was sitting in my usual chair under the old oak tree, watching my teenage grandchildren, Leo and Sophia, chase each other. For a moment, it felt like a family. It felt like home. But I've learned that feelings can lie. The trouble started quietly, when Leo and Sophia got bored and went inside. A few minutes later, they came back out holding something that made my heart freeze. My old leather-bound journal. The giggling started first. Then came the performance. October 12, 1978, Leo began, mimicking a frail, shaky voice that wasn't mine. The rebar for the foundation was laid today. My back aches, but Eleanor says it's the good kind of ache. They read passages about my early days in construction, about my dreams for the business, about the profound loneliness I felt after my wife Eleanor passed away. They turned my private grief into a punchline. The guests shifted uncomfortably, a few offered weak smiles, but my son and his wife did nothing. In fact, they watched with a look of smug amusement, as if my past was a funny little anecdote to entertain their company. They didn't see a man's life in that book. They saw a collection of quirks. I just sat there, frozen. My hands, the same hands that had mixed the mortar for the walls of that house, were clenched on my knees. I didn't say a word. I just watched them desecrate my life, page by page. I looked at Kevin, hoping to see a flicker of shame, of loyalty. Instead, he caught my eye, and seeing my expression, he let out a short, dismissive laugh. He walked over to me, not to defend me, but to manage my reaction. He leaned in and said, loud enough for the others to hear, "Let them be, Dad. It's just old man ramblings. Nobody cares about your old war stories anymore." It wasn't an angry shout. It was a calm, simple judgment, a verdict that my entire existence, all the sacrifice, was irrelevant. That was it. The words hung in the air, heavier than any stone I'd ever lifted. The laughter died down as everyone watched to see what the old man would do. I didn't give them a show. I rose slowly from my chair, my bones protesting, and walked across the lawn. I didn't look at Kevin or Jessica. My eyes were fixed on the journal in Leo's hands. When I reached him, I simply held out my hand. He looked at his father, confused, and then placed the book in my palm. I took it, its worn leather, a familiar comfort, and without a single word to anyone, I turned around and walked back inside the house, into my small room. The door clicked shut behind me, and in that silence, I knew my life in that house was over. Sitting here in the quiet of my little room, the house I built feels as cold and foreign as a stranger's tomb. The walls don't echo with laughter anymore, just the memory of my grandson's mocking voice. I run my thumb over the worn leather of this journal, the one they used as a prop for their little comedy show. Each crease and stain on this cover holds a piece of my life, a life they've decided is nothing more than a collection of silly stories. But this book isn't just about feelings. It's about facts. It's about calloused hands and a promise I made to a woman who was the bedrock of my world. It's about the cost of a son's ambition, a cost he never bothered to calculate, because he never had to pay the bill. My story doesn't start here in this big Dallas house with its manicured lawn. It starts in a place that's more a memory than a map point now. A small town in Ohio where the sky was big and the opportunities were small. We were a working-class family, which is a polite way of saying we were poor. We had enough to get by, but never enough to get ahead. I saw my father break his back for pennies, his dreams shrinking with every passing year until they fit inside a bottle. I knew from a young age that I didn't want that life. I wanted to build things that would stand long after I was gone. So, with less than $50 in my pocket and a whole lot of naive hope, I bought a bus ticket to Dallas, a place I'd heard was booming. The first few years in Texas were brutal. I wasn't a contractor then. I was just another pair of hands for hire, hauling lumber, mixing concrete, doing whatever nobody else wanted to do, under a sun that had no mercy. I lived in a tiny rented room that smelled of dust and loneliness. Some nights, I'd lie awake, my body aching from the work, and wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then morning would come, and I'd see the frames of new buildings rising against the skyline, and I'd feel that pull again. The desire to create, to put my mark on something solid and real. I learned everything I could, watching the master carpenters, the electricians, the plumbers. I absorbed it all, because I knew knowledge was the one tool they couldn't take from me. It was on a dusty construction site that I met Eleanor. She was delivering lunch to her brother, who was a foreman. She walked through that chaotic mess of noise and dirt like she owned the place, with a grace that just stopped me in my tracks. She had a smile that could make a man forget his troubles and eyes that saw right through the grime and sweat to the person underneath. We started talking, and it was easy, like we'd known each other forever. She didn't care that my hands were rough or that I didn't have a fancy education. She saw the man I was trying to become. Eleanor wasn't just the love of my life, she was the architect of it. She believed in me long before I fully believed in myself. When our son Kevin was born, my world shifted on its axis. Holding that tiny, fragile boy in my arms for the first time, I felt a weight of responsibility so profound it almost scared me. It wasn't just about providing for him. It was about giving him a world of possibilities I never had. I looked at his perfect little hands and swore that they would never be as calloused and scarred as mine. He would work with his mind, not his back. He would build things with a pencil and paper, not a hammer and nails. Every dream I ever had for myself, I transferred to him in that moment. He became the new blueprint for my life, the most important project I would ever undertake. From that day forward, I worked like a man possessed. I took every shift, every side job, every overtime hour offered. I started my own small contracting business, built on nothing but my reputation for honesty and hard work. While other men were at the bar or fishing on the weekends, I was poring over blueprints or fixing a leaky roof for a client. I'd come home long after the sun had set, covered in a layer of drywall dust or paint, too tired to even eat. Eleanor would have a plate waiting for me, and she'd just sit with me in silence while I ate, her presence a silent testament of support. I missed bedtime stories and school plays, telling myself it was a necessary sacrifice for a greater good. Kevin's future. I remember one year, for his 10th birthday, all he wanted was a brand new Schwinn bicycle he'd seen in the Sears catalog. It was the kind with the banana seat and the high handlebars. It might as well have been a Cadillac for what it cost. We just didn't have the money. I saw the disappointment in his eyes when he tried to pretend it didn't matter. I couldn't stand it. That week, I took on an emergency roof repair for a family across town. I worked for 3 nights straight after my regular jobs, up on that roof under a single work light, until my muscles screamed. But when I walked in with that gleaming red bike on his birthday morning, the look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face, that was my payment. It made every aching muscle worth it. Building this house was the culmination of everything. It wasn't just another job. It was my masterpiece. I poured the foundation myself, framed the walls with my own crew, and oversaw every single detail. I remember Eleanor planting the sapling that's now the giant oak tree in the backyard. She'd bring me lemonade and tell me which window would be hers for watching the birds. This house was meant to be our fortress, a physical symbol of our shared life and struggle. It was where Kevin would grow up safe, where he'd always have a home to return to. We weren't just building with wood and brick. We were building with love and hope. We were creating a legacy. Seeing Kevin go off to college to study architecture was one of the proudest moments of my life. The first in our family to get a degree, it felt like the perfect circle. I built with my hands, and he would build with his mind, taking our family name to a new level. The tuition was a mountain, and his master's degree was another one right behind it. I never hesitated. I liquidated savings, took out loans against the business, did whatever it took. I never told him the extent of the financial strain. In my mind, it wasn't a burden. It was an investment. It was the fulfillment of the promise I'd made to that little baby in the hospital. I was giving my son the tools to build a better life. Then Eleanor got sick. It started slowly, a tiredness she couldn't shake, a pain she tried to hide. The world, which had been so full of purpose and plans, suddenly shrank to the size of a hospital room. The smell of antiseptic replaced the smell of sawdust. All the strength I had, all the resilience I'd built over the years, felt useless against the slow, cruel march of her illness. She was the strong one, even then. Her biggest worry wasn't for herself, but for me and Kevin. She'd hold my hand, her grip weaker each day, and make me promise I'd look after our boy, that I'd make sure he was happy. On one of her last good days, when the morphine hadn't yet clouded her mind, she looked at me with those clear eyes that had always seen the truth of me. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice raspy, "don't let them forget what this house means, what we built. You take care of our boy, but you never, ever let anyone destroy the value of what we built together." I squeezed her hand and promised I wouldn't. It was a sacred vow, made in the shadow of death. A few days later, she was gone, and the house became a hollow, echoing monument to her absence. The soul of our family had left, and I was left to be its lonely caretaker. After a few years, Kevin was ready to start his own architecture firm. He had the talent and the ambition, but not the capital. He came to me, full of plans and blueprints, his eyes shining with the same fire I once had. He needed a significant amount of money to get it off the ground. It was more than I had in liquid cash. But how could I say no? This was it. This was the culmination of all those double shifts, all that sacrifice. This was the promise to Eleanor in action. So I did what I had to do. I signed the papers, giving him the seed money he needed, feeling a sense of pride that overshadowed any financial worry. I was launching his dream. Then he met Jessica. She was sophisticated, came from a family with money, and had ambitions that made Kevin's look small. When they decided to get married, it had to be a grand affair, something to impress her social circle. The costs were astronomical, far beyond what Kevin could afford, even with his new firm. He was stressed, and Jessica was insistent. She made it clear that a simple wedding was out of the question. Kevin came to me, ashamed but desperate, and laid out the numbers. It was a staggering amount. I knew he was asking for the impossible, but seeing the panic in his eyes, I felt that old instinct kick in. Fix it. Protect my son. I had one thing left from my past, one piece of my own history that I had held on to. It was a small plot of land my parents had left me back in Ohio, right on a little creek. It was nothing special to anyone else, but to me, it was sacred. It was where I was going to build a small cabin for my retirement, a quiet place to fish and remember Eleanor. It was my last personal dream. But my son's happiness, or what I thought was his happiness, felt more important. So I sold it. I sold my last dream to pay for his wedding. I never told him what that land meant to me. I just signed the papers, transferred the money, and watched him marry a woman who looked at me like I was a piece of old furniture. The years that followed were a slow, painful lesson in irrelevance. Once Kevin and Jessica moved into this house with me, supposedly to take care of me, I became a ghost. My opinions were ignored, my routines were an inconvenience. I was moved from the master bedroom I had shared with Eleanor into this small back room. My presence at the dinner table became a source of tension, until Jessica suggested I eat earlier to not hold everyone up. My stories, the ones I used to tell Kevin about the old days, the ones he used to listen to with wide eyes, became ramblings. They were the same stories, but the listener had changed. He no longer heard the lessons, he only heard the ramblings of an old man. And so, here I sit, with this journal in my lap. The same journal my grandchildren, his children, turned into a joke. The same life my son dismissed in front of his friends. He said, "No one cares about my old war stories. He's wrong. I care." And Eleanor would have cared. The promise I made to her wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about protecting the value of our life's work. The dignity, the sacrifice, the love that built this family from nothing. And as I sit here in the silence, I realize that for years, I've been letting him and his wife demolish that value, brick by painful brick. The demolition stops tonight. The change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping fog that settled over the house after Kevin married Jessica. At first, it was small things, almost too petty to notice. She would reorganize the living room, moving the photos of Eleanor and me to a less prominent shelf. She'd compliment my work on the house, with a tone that sounded more like she was praising a clever handyman than the man who designed and built the very ground she stood on. She came from money, and she had a way of talking about my life's work, my calloused hands, that made it sound like a quaint, charming story of a time long past, something to be dusted off and put away. Kevin, blinded by what he thought was love, saw nothing wrong. He just saw a wife who was improving our home. Her influence on Kevin was like a slow-acting poison. She started making comments about my old-fashioned ways, the way I dressed, the simple food I liked, the early hours I kept. "We should get your dad some new clothes, Kevin. He deserves to look a bit more modern," she'd say, not out of kindness, but out of embarrassment. She was chipping away at my identity, trying to sand down my rough edges to fit into the smooth, polished world she wanted to build for herself. Kevin would just nod along, eager to please her. He started seeing me through her eyes, not as the father who gave him everything, but as a project that needed managing, an old relic that didn't quite match the new decor. He was slowly trading his loyalty for her approval. The first big blow came about a year into their marriage. They sat me down in the living room, a space that was starting to feel less and less mine. With practiced gentleness, Jessica explained that since my bedroom, the master bedroom I had shared with Eleanor, had an attached bathroom, it would be much more practical for them to have it. They were younger, had to get ready for work, and it would just make more sense. They had already prepared the small guest room in the back for me. "It's cozier, Dad," Kevin said, avoiding my eyes. "And it's right by the garden." They weren't asking, they were telling. I was being moved, displaced inside my own fortress. My sanctuary, the room where every corner held a memory of my wife, was being taken from me for the sake of convenience. I didn't fight it. What was I to do? Argue? Make a scene? I just nodded and packed my things the next day. Moving my clothes into that small closet, I felt a piece of myself die. The room was cozy, all right. It was small. It was a room for a visitor, a temporary guest, not the patriarch of the family. From my new window, I could see the oak tree Eleanor and I had planted. It used to be a symbol of our strength and growth. Now it felt like it was watching me in my little box, a silent witness to my slow demotion. I was no longer the head of the household. I was a tenant with memories they didn't have space for anymore. Then came the decisions about the house itself. One summer, Jessica decided the backyard needed a complete overhaul. The simple stone patio I had laid by hand was dated. The vegetable garden Eleanor loved was too much work. They were going to put in a fancy deck, an outdoor kitchen, things I saw in magazines. They hired a landscape architect, a young man who walked around my yard with a clipboard, pointing out all its flaws. They never once asked my opinion. I, who had graded this land and knew every inch of it, was treated like a bystander. I'd watch them from my window, discussing plans and looking at blueprints, and the silence from them was louder than any insult. They were erasing my history and Eleanor's one paving stone at a time. I tried to talk to Kevin about it once. I found him alone in the garage, and I mentioned, as gently as I could, that his mother had always loved those rose bushes they were planning to tear out. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "Dad, we have to update things. Jessica knows what she's doing. It's going to increase the property value." He said it like he was explaining a simple fact to a child. He didn't understand. The value I cared about wasn't in dollars and cents. It was in the memory of Eleanor's hands in the soil, in the shared sweat that had built this place. But he couldn't see that anymore. He only saw things through the lens of cost and appearance, the language his wife had taught him. My birthdays became a sad joke. In the years after Eleanor passed, Kevin and I would have a quiet steak dinner at my favorite place. It was simple, but it was ours. After Jessica, things changed. The first birthday they were married, they forgot. Completely. Around 9 o'clock that night, Kevin rushed into my room with a cupcake from the grocery store, a single candle stuck in it, his face a mask of guilt. "Sorry, Dad, we got so busy." The next year, Jessica organized a party. It was really just a get-together for her friends, where I was presented like an antique. They sang a quick, off-key, "Happy Birthday," and then everyone went back to their conversations, leaving me sitting alone with a slice of cake I didn't want. I remember that night clearly. I sat there in my old armchair, watching these strangers laugh and drink in the house my sacrifice had paid for. I felt invisible. I thought of my birthdays with Eleanor. She never made a big fuss, but she always made me feel seen. She'd make my favorite meal, pot roast, and we'd just sit and talk. Her gift was her presence, her full, undivided attention. It was a treasure. What I got from Kevin and Jessica was a performance of affection, a box ticked on their list of duties. The emptiness in that crowded room was more profound than any loneliness I had ever felt before. It was the loneliness of being surrounded by people who were supposed to be your family but saw you as a burden. The distance they put between me and my grandchildren, Leo and Sophia, was the cruelest cut of all. When they were little, they were my shadow. I'd teach them how to hammer a nail, how to identify birds at the feeder. They'd climb into my lap and beg for stories about the old days. We had a bond. But as they got older, Jessica started interfering. "Don't bother Grandpa, he's tired," she'd say, or, "Go play in your room, you're making a mess in here." The living room, the heart of the home, became off-limits for the kind of simple, messy play that a boy and his grandfather enjoy. My role was reduced to a quiet way from a distance. I watched them being molded by their parents' values. They started spending more time with their iPads than with people. Their conversations shifted to brand names and what their friends had. The warmth they once had for me cooled into a kind of polite indifference. They were taught, through 1,000 small actions, that my world of simple things, of hard work, of stories, of memories, was less important than their world of screens and social status. I was losing them, not to time, but to a deliberate campaign of alienation orchestrated by their own mother, with their father as a silent accomplice. The day they used my journal for laughs wasn't the start of the problem. It was the culmination of years of being taught that I didn't matter. The final, undeniable proof of my status in the house came at the dinner table. I've always been a slow eater. It's just my way. It used to be a point of gentle teasing from Eleanor. With Jessica, it was a source of constant, visible irritation. She would tap her fingers, sigh loudly, and exchange pointed looks with Kevin as I finished my meal. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I started eating faster, not enjoying my food, just trying to avoid being the cause of her displeasure. It felt like a race I could never win, to prove I wasn't an inconvenience. One evening, after a particularly long day, I was more tired than usual, and I was eating even more slowly. Jessica had guests over, a couple she was trying to impress. After a few minutes of her silent fuming, she finally broke. She turned to Kevin, but her words were for the whole table to hear. "You know, Kevin," she said with a bright false smile, "it might be better if your father ate a bit earlier from now on. That way, we don't have to hold up our evenings waiting for him and his little quirks." There it was, a polite, smiling, public banishment. She didn't just suggest it, she announced it as a settled fact. She had declared me unfit for the family table. I looked at Kevin. I prayed he would say something, anything, defend me, tell her she was out of line, tell her this was my house, and I would eat whenever I pleased. But he just sat there, his face tight, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He chose her. He chose peace with his wife over his father's dignity. In his silence, he agreed with her verdict. I was a problem, a quirk to be managed. The other guests stared at their plates, the air crackling with embarrassment. I put my fork down, the food tasting like ash in my mouth. I didn't say a word. I just pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked to my room. That night, for the first time in the house I had built, I ate dinner alone in my room. Jessica had someone bring me a tray, as if I were an invalid. The plate was cold. The silence in that small room was deafening. I could hear their laughter filtering through the door from the dining room, the sound of a life I was no longer a part of. It was in that moment, staring at that cold plate of food, that I truly understood. I wasn't just being neglected, I was being systematically erased. They were tidying me away, putting me out of sight so their perfect life could continue, uninterrupted by the messy reality of an old man. This erasure extended to my things, the physical remnants of my life. My favorite armchair, the one with the worn arms where Eleanor and I had sat for countless hours, disappeared one afternoon. In its place was a sleek, modern thing that was as uncomfortable as it looked. "The old one was so stained and shabby, Arthur," Jessica explained, not even bothering to call me Dad. "This one is much more chic." She hadn't thrown it away. She had relegated it to the damp, musty basement, a tomb for things she deemed unworthy. Going down there and seeing it covered in a dusty sheet felt like visiting a grave. The garage had always been my domain. It was where I kept my tools, the tools that had built our lives. It was organized, functional, a space of work and purpose. One Saturday, I went out to find Kevin and a team of organizers Jessica had hired. They were putting everything into plastic bins, labeling them with a neat, impersonal script. My tools were mixed in with old toys and Christmas decorations. My workbench, which I had built from solid oak, was being dismantled to make room for more shelving for their sports equipment. Kevin saw me standing there, looking lost. "It's for the best, Dad. It was a mess. Now we'll be able to find everything." He didn't realize he wasn't organizing a mess. He was dismantling my life's work. I started spending more time just watching them. An invisible observer in my own home. I'd see them in the kitchen in the morning, a flurry of activity as Kevin and Jessica got ready for work and the kids for school. They moved around each other with an easy rhythm, a self-contained unit. They discussed their day, their plans for the weekend, their upcoming vacation. They never included me. I'd be sitting in my room, the door slightly ajar, listening to the sounds of a family that functioned perfectly well, perhaps even better, without my participation. I was an outsider looking in through a window, except the window was the door to my own bedroom. It was in one of those quiet moments of observation, a few weeks before that fateful barbecue, that the final, crushing truth settled in my bones. I saw Jessica looking at a calendar, and then she glanced towards my room with a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance. I knew what she was thinking about. My upcoming doctor's appointment, the one she would have to drive me to. In her eyes, I wasn't a person. I wasn't her husband's father. I was an inconvenient appointment on her calendar. A chore. A problem to be managed. The love was gone. The respect was gone. All that was left was a sense of obligation, and it was an obligation they were clearly growing tired of. That was when I knew the foundation of our family was cracked beyond repair. So I sat there, in that little room they'd given me, the echo of their laughter still ringing in my ears. The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold weight in my chest. But as the minutes ticked by, something else started to burn through the cold. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind of sharp, cold clarity you get just before dawn. I looked down at the journal in my hands. They thought this book was a joke, a collection of sentimental nonsense. They had no idea what it really was. They saw an old man's diary. They should have seen a builder's ledger. I opened it, not to the pages they'd read, but to the beginning. The time for feeling hurt was over. It was time to review the blueprints. You see, I am a builder. It's not just what I did for a living. It's who I am. A builder is meticulous. He measures everything. He documents every cost, every beam, every nail. He knows that a foundation built on guesses will crumble. My life has been no different. This journal, the one they mocked, wasn't just for my feelings about Eleanor or my aching back. Every single page is a record. Every entry is dated. Every significant event is noted with the precision of a surveyor. They laughed at my ramblings about the price of lumber in 1985. They didn't understand. They were laughing at the evidence. They thought my memory was fading into a collection of stories, but my memory was written in ink, undeniable and permanent. The first major entry concerning my son is dated May 14, 1995. I wrote, "Loan to Kevin for firm startup minus $50,000. I remember the day perfectly. He came to me, his eyes shining with ambition, the blueprints for his future spread across the kitchen table. He was too proud to ask for a loan, and I was too proud of him to call it that to his face. I told him it was an investment in his dream, a father's gift. But in this book, in the private ledger of my life, I recorded the truth. It was a loan I hoped he would one day be successful enough to repay, not because I needed the money, but because repaying it would prove he understood its value." That was just the beginning. The entries continued over the years, a quiet testament to his growing needs and my shrinking savings. August 2002, $35,000. Down payment for Jessica's car. I remember her saying how important it was for her image to drive something, quote, respectable. Then, March 2008, $75,000 to cover losses from a bad stock market bet. Kevin was ashamed that time, but his shame didn't stop him from taking the money. Page after page, it's all there. The vacations they couldn't afford. The country club membership. The private school tuition for the grandchildren. I never said no, I just made a note. Adding it all up in my head now, the total is staggering. Over $400,000. To them, it was an endless river of support. In this book, it's a debt. I didn't keep these records because I'm a bitter old man who holds a grudge. I started doing it because it's my nature to be precise. But after Eleanor passed, my reason changed. I saw how easily Kevin was swayed by Jessica's hunger, for more, for better, for shinier things. I saw how he was starting to forget where he came from, to forget the smell of sawdust and the feel of an honest day's labor. I kept this record to honor the promise I made to his mother. I promised to protect the sum of value of what we built. This journal wasn't a weapon. It was a shield. A shield to protect our legacy from the slow, creeping rot of entitlement. They looked at me and saw a relic. An old man in an old chair telling old stories. They saw a dependent. A man who needed them to drive him to the doctor and manage his simple life. The irony is so thick it makes me want to weep. They never once thought to ask how a retired contractor, whose business had been modest, could fund their lavish lifestyle for decades. They never questioned the source of the river because they believed they were entitled to drink from it. Their arrogance was a blindfold. They couldn't see the man right in front of them. My quietness was not weakness, it was observation, and my ramblings were a meticulously kept account of their ingratitude. But the loans are only one part of the story. They are the foundation of the secret, but not the whole structure. About 10 years ago, a young man came to see me. His name was Miguel. He was a kid from a rough neighborhood with a fire in his belly, trying to make it in real estate development. He reminded me of myself at his age. Hungry, smart, but with no connections and no capital. Everyone else saw a risk. I saw potential. I didn't give him much money. I didn't have much to give at the time. What I gave him was my time, my knowledge, and my name. I taught him how to read a site plan, how to negotiate with subcontractors, and how to build a reputation on your word alone. Miguel never forgot. He turned out to be more successful than anyone could have imagined. He's a major player in Dallas real estate now, with a portfolio of projects that are shaping the city's skyline. 5 years ago, he came back to this very house. He didn't offer me a check. He knew better. He came with a proposition. He said, "Arthur, you taught me how to build an empire. You're the architect of my success. I want to make you a silent partner in my new development company." He wasn't asking for money. He was offering me a share, a piece of the future, in gratitude for the past. I accepted. My son and his wife have no idea. They live in this house, complaining about the cost of property taxes, while I sit on a silent partnership that is currently valued at over $3 million. I've never touched a dime of it. I've never changed my lifestyle. I still wear the same old flannel shirts and drink my coffee from the same chipped mug. The money was never the point. The money was a tool. It was the final, undeniable proof that the values I lived by, honesty, hard work, investing in people, were not just old war stories. They were the bedrock of a fortune Kevin couldn't even fathom. The bitterness of the irony is what chokes me. I watch them stress over credit card bills for luxury goods. I listen to Jessica brag to her friends about their self-made success. Self-made? Their entire lifestyle, the house they live in, the cars they drive, the image they project to the world, is a fiction. It's a stage play funded by a man they treat like a piece of inconvenient furniture. They are living a life of borrowed prestige, completely unaware that the bank they've been borrowing from is the quiet old man in the back room, the one whose stories nobody cares about. And in this quiet room, holding this book, the words of my promise to Eleanor echo in my mind. I'll never let anyone destroy the value of what we built together. For so long, I thought that meant protecting the house, the physical structure. But I see it now. The value wasn't just in the bricks and mortar. It was in the dignity of our struggle. It was in the meaning of our sacrifice. Kevin, under Jessica's influence, hasn't just neglected me. He has actively devalued the very principles that gave him his start in life. He has traded his inheritance of character for a fleeting inheritance of cash. That's why I took the final step 5 years ago. It was after the incident at the dinner table, the night Jessica banished me to my room. I knew then that a simple conversation would never be enough. The rot was too deep. So I went to see a lawyer, a sharp man, who understood the language of both contracts and consequences. I had him draft a new will. Tucked securely inside the back cover of this very journal is a notarized copy of that document. It's the final blueprint. The one that lays out the true and final cost of everything. The terms are very simple. Upon my death, this house, which is now valued at over $1.2 million, will not be inherited by my son, Kevin Wright. Neither will my shares in the development company, nor any other asset to my name. Everything, every brick, every dollar, every memory, will go to a charitable foundation established in my wife's name, the Eleanor Wright Foundation, dedicated to providing scholarships and seed money for young men and women trying to enter the building trades. It will give others the start that I fought so hard for. There is, however, one clause, a single path for Kevin to nullify this arrangement. He can claim his inheritance under one condition. He must repay the entirety of the loans documented in this journal, all $400,000 of them, calculated with a modest, bank rate interest from the date of each loan. It's not a punishment, it's a choice. He can have the money, but first, he must acknowledge the debt. He must, for the first time in his adult life, understand the true cost of his father's love. He must face the numbers, written in my own hand, and see the sum of my sacrifice. So you see, I am not the victim they think I am. I am not a frail old man lost in his memories. I am the man who built this house and the man who will decide its fate. They underestimated me. They mistook my patience for senility and my silence for surrender. They were so busy looking down on me that they never thought to look at what I was holding in my hands. They thought they were rewriting my story, turning it into a comedy. They have no idea that I wrote the ending a long, long time ago. And as I sit here, the house finally quiet, the decision is no longer a plan held in reserve. It is a reality waiting to be set in motion. The pain in my chest has been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. The foundation has been laid. The structure is sound. The time has come to sign off on the work. I reach for my phone, my old, callous thumb scrolling through the contacts. I find the name I'm looking for, Miguel. It's time to make the call. The time for quiet observation is over. The lesson is about to begin. That night, sleep didn't come. I didn't toss and turn with anger or grief. Instead, a profound calm settled over me, the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm has passed. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the moon cast long shadows across the yard, and I knew what had to be done. The time for absorbing blows was over. Around 3 a.m., I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Miguel's name. He was more than a business partner. He was a man who understood the value of a foundation, both in buildings and in life. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert. I didn't have to explain much. I just said, "Miguel, it's time." There was a pause, and then he said, "I'll make the arrangements. Your new place will be ready by sunrise, Arthur. Welcome back to your life." That was it. The final blueprint was approved. The work was about to begin. Before the sun had even hinted at its arrival, I packed a single, small suitcase. I didn't take much. A few changes of clothes, a photograph of Eleanor, and my father's old watch. I walked through the silent house, my house, for the last time. Every floorboard I had laid, every wall I had framed, seemed to hold its breath. In the living room, I placed my journal on the polished coffee table Jessica had bought. I didn't leave it closed. I opened it to the page dated May 14th, 1995. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Loan to Kevin for firm startup minus $50,000. I left it there, an open book, a silent witness to a debt long forgotten. I didn't look back as I closed the front door behind me. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards my own life, leaving behind the weight of their ingratitude. Miguel had arranged everything. The apartment was on the 20th floor of a new building downtown, one of his own projects. It had wide windows that looked out over the entire city, a skyline I had helped build. The place was furnished simply but with quality, everything solid and real. It felt clean. It felt quiet. It felt safe. Miguel was there to meet me, not with pity, but with a firm handshake and a key. "This is yours, Arthur," he said. "No strings, just respect." For the first time in years, I breathed freely. I wasn't a burden in someone else's house. I wasn't a collection of old stories. I was Arthur Wright, a builder, standing in a place I had earned, looking out at a world of my own making. The peace that washed over me was worth more than any fortune. It was the feeling of dignity restored. A few days later, my lawyer called Kevin and Jessica for what he termed an urgent meeting regarding your father's estate. They arrived at the house, I'm told, with expressions of weary concern, likely expecting to discuss putting me in a home. But when they walked into the living room, they didn't just find my lawyer. Sitting in my old armchair, calm and composed, was Miguel. I can only imagine the shock on Kevin's face. Here was the man he had spent years trying to impress, a titan of industry, waiting for him in his own living room. My lawyer, a man who wastes no words, simply gestured to the journal still sitting on the table. "Mr. Wright asked me to clarify a few things," he began, his voice neutral and professional. The trap wasn't loud or angry. It was a quiet, corporate meeting about a lifetime of bad debt. My lawyer didn't accuse. He simply read. He went through the journal, page by page, entry by entry. The startup loan, the car, the bailout from the bad investment, the private school tuition. He read the dates and the amounts in a flat, dispassionate tone, while an accountant sat by, tallying the total with interest. I was told Kevin's face went from pale to ashen as the numbers climbed, each one a nail in the coffin of his self-made myth, all in front of Miguel. Then the lawyer read the final document, the terms of my will. The house, the partnership, everything, left to a foundation in Eleanor's name. The only way to inherit was to repay the debt in full. There was no shouting, no crying, just a heavy, crushing silence. The truth, finally presented not as a rambling story, but as a cold, hard ledger. My life's work wasn't a joke. It was an asset, and the bill had finally come due. My dignity was my own again.